So on to part two. Typically, I lead the group through this and poke and prod people trying to get, some answers out of them for these questions. And since I can prod, but I can't get the answers from you, it's probably going to be a lot less annoying than if you were in here with a group and me. But we're going to just look at some other evolutionary concepts, some certain patterns that you see, some things that Darwin saw in his movement for all around these various islands and mainlands and stuff. For instance, it is not unusual to find, if you compare the typical individual of a species on an island to the typical individual of the species on the mainland, that the island species, the individuals are way smaller. Which is, when you think about it, not that easy to come up with a clear evolutionary pattern. So that's why it's a tricky question. Is people go, well, there's less food. Yeah, and it may just be that the food is a less continuous in large amounts. That if food was an issue, you have to think about how the first population as it grew didn't just exceed its own food supply, but it may be that they had to broaden out to food that was maybe not as good, and also the idea of, okay, let's get grown up and make more babies and not put on a lot of bulk and use up more resources, turns out to be an advantage under conditions of not great food, not a lot of food that you're not going to completely eat your way through and then kill everybody, but food is a definite issue for size. The number two question is, it's not unusual to find versions on an island that compared to the mainland are way bigger. Big sloths or big, all sorts of different animals where that's true. And people often go, well, that means there's more food. There's more food on the island than there is on the mainland? That's probably not going to do it. But you think of things like dodo birds, which are essentially big pigeons. You can't see big pigeons. And there have been, Galapagos tortoises. There's lots and lots of animals where the relative on the mainland are fairly small, the relatives on the islands are fairly large. And there you got to think about not what is on the island, but what's not on the island. Why is there an advantage to a species being small? Is that they're quick, they can hide, they can get into burrows, they can live in burrows. Well, what is all that a response to that maybe wasn't there on the island when their ancestors got to the island? Think about that. The next one is tricky. People have trouble with it, mostly because it's a tricky ask here. But it's also not unusual to find on islands birds whose relatives elsewhere fly, but they don't fly. They're flightless birds on these usually pretty isolated islands. Now, coming up with advantages to flight is really, really easy. But in order for flight to kind of go away as a feature, then the disadvantages must have outweighed the advantages. And then, so the question is, so what are the disadvantages? What are disadvantages to flying? Wouldn't we all like to be able to fly? But there are disadvantages under these island conditions, and that's an important thing to think about. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, and one is fine, just give me a disadvantage to flying. Then we get into some weird connections in the next part. To a large extent, you can separate birds. This is more analogy separation, what they do, than homology. There can be related birds that are, this one and that one are related, but they're in the two different groups. And it has to do with what comes out of the egg. Is that some birds, the egg hatches out, and what you're looking at is a fetus. It's all scrunchy and barely has any feathers and can barely move. Can't really do much of anything for itself. Got to be, fed. But some birds, the eggs hatch out, and you get a baby that can't fly because it takes too long. None of them hatch out of an egg ready to fly. But man, they can move around. They're very coordinated. They don't need to be fed. There's another thing that these two groups have in common and have in common that they don't have in common with each other. This is all of my labs have very tricky questions that I really want you to think through, that I don't necessarily want to lead you right to the answer. So I'm going to leave this as one of those. It's very tricky, and if you've got an idea but you're not sure, you can always contact me and I'll let you know and kind of get you in the right direction. Camouflage is obviously a big deal. Being able to blend in your environment so that predators can't find you is really, really good. But there are animals, and I mentioned this actually with the Turbo cartoon in lecture, where standing out is also an advantage. Basically, a way that an animal goes, I want you to be able to see me. I want you to know that I'm here. And now the question is, so what's the connected trait there? And sometimes it isn't colors. Sometimes it applies to another sense, but it still makes them stand out. Get too close to a rattlesnake, you'll know they're there. You may not be able to see them, but you'll know they're there. Again, they're standing out from their environment purposely to send you a message. And my question is, so what's the message here? Flip the sheet. We've talked about sexual selection, traits that give advantages in reproduction. But of course, if you're a better reproducer, you're going to send those traits on to more offspring. And so those traits can become fairly common traits in a population. So, moose has big antlers. It can fight for dominance over other male moose and have more access to females. That's a sexual selection trait, and the antlers are a feature that's advantageous to the male moose. The female moose don't even have antlers. But that's not an unusual thing where the males get the big feature. And the question is, so it's a sexual selection trait. It's an advantage to their male offspring. There's a hidden message in those that tells a potential female mate, these not just going to give an advantage to our males, going to give an advantage to our females too. It's technically known as the handicap theory. So that's a big clue. But the question here is, so what's the message to potential mates that this is not just good for the males that we're going to have, but this is going to be useful to the females too. They'll be better off with me as their dad. And here's the evidence for it. And as it says, even things like, lots of money in a fancy car is part of the handicap theory. Seven is, and I've mentioned this a little bit, if you look at my evolution of diseases video that's up there for another class that talks about it as well. Typically, diseases are generally caused by invaders, other living things that wind up in a host, don't get along physiologically that well with the host and cause a lot of problems. Some, just symptomatic problems, some life-threatening problems. These things jump from one species to another. You'll get a variant that's, happily living in one species, and the variant can make the jump into another host. And then in order for it to be useful to the disease organism, the variant also needs to be able to move from that host to another host of the same type. So when the flu moves from birds to people, which it did a couple of years ago, is the only way for that variant of influenza to become really successful as a human disease is to have a variant that moves from people to people. And the bird flu, I won't say never did it, because there is evidence that it did it in one isolated place in Malaysia, but it never developed a widely disseminated variant that was human to human contagious. But as I said, they're new, they're messing things up, they're making hosts sick, they're killing hosts off, and they're producing variants. Typically in that situation, if you stand back and watch, over time, the disease will go from having a high impact, high nasty symptom rate, high mortality rate, to less so. Mortality rate goes down, severity, the symptoms tends to go down, and there's an evolutionary reason for that, is that it's a benefit to the organisms that are causing the disease, and I just want you to tell me what the advantage is. I mean, obviously it's an advantage to the host, they're not being killed as much, but it's an advantage to the things that are making them sick as well. That's what I'm looking for here. What's that advantage? Notice we're not doing advantages, disadvantages here. We're just doing advantages. And number 8 is that different animals have different senses. Is that, I mean, rattlesnake is basically making a warning for animals that can hear. Not very effective for animals that don't hear, but there's not that many that it needs to do that at. And in terms of vision, we see a pretty broad range of color. Other animals see more limited ranges of colors. Dogs see more limited ranges. Some animals see broader ranges of color, and some animals see shifted ranges of color, where, you know, from ultraviolet to infrared, they, you know, shift up toward the ultraviolet, and some of the colors that are up near that shift down toward the infrared, and some of the colors that are associated with that. If you look at pollinators, plants that produce purple flowers are very often pollinated by bees, but virtually never pollinated by beetles. Whereas red flowers, very commonly pollinated by beetles, virtually never pollinated by bees. Now the question is, what does that tell you about the beetles and the bees? Leave it there. We do have bonus questions. You don't have to answer the bonus questions. You don't lose points if you get one wrong. You do get 2 points if you get them right, but they're here. So symptoms. Disease gets in you and causes symptoms. You cough. You bleed in the case of Ebola. You sneeze. That is not helping you. It's not, you know, not warning others away, because they don't, typically that's not an instinct that animals have, although you would think there'd be an advantage to it, but very typically that's not an advantage that animals have. They may avoid a really debilitated and sick member of their species, but a little bit of symptoms, because, you know, you're coughing. There's a reason why we cough and sneeze. They just say, hey, but those symptoms are not helping you in any way. So the question is, why are you getting the symptoms? Got to think about this. There's a genetic process or genetic feature called hybrid vigor, discovered originally in sickle cell anemia, and has since been found in things like tuberculosis and Tay-Sachs disease and a bunch of other things, potentially schizophrenia, where it's found that sickle cell anemia is a recessive feature. In order to have sickle cell, you need a copy of the bad code from mom and a copy from dad, and then all you can do is make bad hemoglobin. Is that as you deplete the oxygen, it sickles up, and your blood cells sickle up, and they jam up going through your blood vessels. That's pretty bad for you. Years ago, two different people working on the same campus kind of stumbled that each of them was kind of looking at a map of the same thing, but for one of them, it was the map of the ancestry of African Americans with sickle cell. What parts of Africa did these people's ancestors come from? And for the other guy, who was a disease specialist, it was a map of endemic malaria areas in Africa, and they were pretty much the same map. So I was like, oh, is there a connection between sickle cell and malaria? And that eventually led to the discovery of hybrid vigor in a malarial area. If you get 2 sickle cell alleles, you get sickle cell. Pretty bad for you. If you get 2 regular hemoglobin alleles, functional hemoglobin alleles, that's more likely to kill you from malaria. Why? Well, if you get 1 sickle cell allele and 1 hemoglobin allele, your blood cells are a mixture of those two products of those two codes. So you have a potential sickle cell hemoglobin and a potential regular hemoglobin. Under normal conditions where you're not really facing low oxygen levels, so people who have what they call sickle cell trait can have issues with high altitudes, they can have issues with extensive exercise, but under normal conditions, their cells won't sickle up because at any one time they're not so depleted that they can change the shape of the cells. But if you have 1 and 1 and you get malaria, malaria actually reproduces in red blood cells and produces tremendous oxygen depletion in those red blood cells. And under those conditions, the red blood cells crinkle up and you have an automatic response to old worn out blood cells to take them and tear them all down and recycle the bits and pieces. What that does is it kills the malaria that was in that cell. So to sickle cell, bad codes. To regular hemoglobin, bad codes if you're exposed to malaria. 1 and 1, you're unlikely for the sickle cell to really hurt you much. And you're resistant to the nastiness of malaria. You're much more likely to survive a bout of malaria. So this, what should be a bad allele, is now an advantage passed on to your offspring. As long as they get the right mix, they continue to pass it on. And the question we got to here is, so sickle cell is relatively common in certain populations. Is that features that give advantages become more common in populations. And sometimes they will piggyback on a really good code if they're very close together on the same DNA. And for a long time, I think that's what folks figured was going on with sickle cell. They couldn't find the code that it was piggybacking on, but they eventually found hybrid vigor. The thing is, the people that really are tied into how evolution works, once this came out, should have gone, well, of course, that's why it works that way. And it kind of builds on what we've been doing for the whole lab. So I want you to kind of flesh out why, of course, it should have worked that way. Because we have this, and this is how evolution works. So that's your second bonus question. And that's the lab.